Hello, everyone. I'm Juliet Oliver, the General Counsel and an executive here at the Solicitors Regulation Authority. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this session on workplace culture, our rules, and getting it right for your firm. This is part of our virtual compliance conference. So the plan is that we're going to see a recording of the presentation from our session at the Compliance Officers Conference, which took place a couple of weeks ago. But the aim is to make this session as interactive as possible, and we want to answer as many of your questions as possible. So we'll have time after the video for a new live Q&A. And our panelists from the session, Bahari Hayward, who is the Chief Risk and Compliance Officer at Clifford Chance, Jody Hill, founder and managing partner of Thrive Law, and Elizabeth Rimmer, the Chief Executive of Lawcare, have kindly joined me again today, and together we'll be happy to answer your questions. So if you have any, what you'll need to do is just click on the link below this broadcast and submit your question. It's always nice to know your name, but you can do it anonymously if you prefer. And do please put them in during the video whenever they occur to you. Get your questions in early so we have time to pick up as many as possible after the video. So I look forward to the Q&A, but first onto the recording. It's going to last approximately 25 minutes, and then I'll see you after that.
Hi, welcome. Thanks. People are just coming in, taking their seats. But let me kick off by saying welcome to the session, looking at workplace culture and how to get it right for your firm. I just wanted to start by saying well-being in the legal sector is a topic that is front of mind, I know, for many in the profession. And it certainly is for us at the SRA. We have been looking at it closely in the last few years. And you may have been to our in-person or seen our virtual session on the topic last year. And if you did, you'll recall that we have been involved in a programme of work to try and understand better the root causes of issues and concerns in the workplace environment, to look at firm culture, and to set out guidance on our regulatory expectations for firms and what they need to do to protect and support employees and colleagues. And earlier this year, we made changes to our codes of conduct to introduce explicit requirements around the treatment of colleagues. And these really, as I say, make explicit our view about the importance of the workplace and working relationships in the delivery of competent and ethical legal services. And that's something we hadn't done and certainly hadn't had something on the face of our rules about before then. We're seeing some signs in our casework that firms are becoming more aware that this is a regulatory issue, and we'll be doing some evaluation of the impact of our new rules next year. But in this session, we've got a great panel here to talk about what changes are happening in practice. And we're going to explore why workplace culture matters to firms and to the people who work in them, as well as to us as a regulator. So in terms of how the session will work, we're going to first hear from each of our panelists in turn, and then open the floor up to some questions. And we're really keen for the session to be interactive, so please do pop up your hand. We've got a couple of mics roaming around the room, and we'd love to hear from you. But before we start with the panel session. Firstly, just to introduce ourselves, I'm Juliet Oliver. I'm the General Counsel and I'm on the executive at the SRA. Tony Stafford is a policy manager at the SRA. He's been very much involved in our recent rule changes. And I'm also delighted to welcome 3 external speakers, all of whom have contributed to our thinking and really, have been very generous with their thoughts and their insights. We have got Bahari Hayward, who is Chief Risk and Compliance Officer at Clifford Chance, and she's helped to lead the firm's work on its values and code of conduct, and can give us some real insights into leading change in a large firm environment. And we have Jody Hill, who is the founder and managing partner at Thrive Law, an employment law firm with a real focus on enabling well-being. And Jody took part in our thematic review on workplace culture and provided a video speaking about a number of things, but also about embedding values in the workplace. And that's one of the resources on our website, so I would commend that to everyone. And we've also got Elizabeth Rimmer, who is known to many of you, I know, for her impressive work as the Chief Executive of Lawcare, the mental wellbeing charity for the legal community. So to kick off, Tony, I wanted to turn to you to start, really just to cover what the SRA expects of firms and individuals, and particularly why does the SRA think it's important for firms to think about their culture, and why have we made the recent changes to our Code of Conduct?
Yeah, thank you, Juliet, and good afternoon, everyone. So the first question for us as a regulator is what's going on here? Is there a problem with workplace culture? And if so, what sort of impact is it having? What sort of regulatory risks is it creating? And I think the first sort of piece of evidence that struck the organisation was that in our casework, we do see a fairly significant number of cases where a problem is either being caused by or it's being made worse by the culture that's happening in a firm. The classic example, which we actually spoke about a bit at the compliance issues session this morning, for those who were there, is if you've got a relatively junior solicitor who's being bullied or pressurised to do the wrong thing or to cover up a mistake. So that's the casework angle. There's also an increasing body of research that backs up that there are issues with workplace culture in law firms, including by Lawcare, Elizabeth's organisation, and also the Junior Lawyers Division of the Law Society. And that has demonstrated that there is a fairly significant number of people in law firms who say that they've experienced unfair treatment and that they need support to deal with that. And there's also quite striking evidence that people from groups with some protected characteristics are more likely to say that they've experienced unfair treatment. And that's really quite a wide group, so it includes women, it includes people from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic background, disabled solicitors, younger solicitors, and also LGBTQ plus people. So that's quite striking, and obviously there are immediate concerns there that the health and well-being of the people affected are suffering from that. But other things that are important to us as a regulator, first of all, as I said, well-being issues, culture issues can cause problems which affect the interests of clients, so that's clearly a concern for us. And more widely, you can have a situation where a really toxic workplace culture can start to affect public confidence in the profession, potentially. And that can be an issue for clients, potentially even for prospective employees in a firm. And another factor that we're aware of is that because of, as I mentioned, people with protected characteristics potentially suffering more from unfair treatment, a problem with workplace culture can undermine the work that firms do to promote equality, diversity and inclusion. And certainly if you have an unhealthy culture, then people from some of those groups may be less likely to stay in a firm, may be less likely to do well. So as a regulator, we have objectives which include the public interest, protecting the interests of consumers, and encouraging a diverse and effective profession. So for all those reasons, this is something that we do take very seriously. So I'll just run very quickly through some of what we've been doing about it. The first step really was a thematic review into workplace culture that the SRA ran a couple of years ago now, where our thematic team go and visit firms, talk to people at management level in firms, but also employees, and to other interested organisations. And that was really trying to focus on the positives. So what can we find about how firms create an effective, healthy culture, and how can we share that learning? But it did back up some of the concerns from other evidence, because around a quarter of people that we spoke to said that they felt the culture in their firm wasn't healthy. But the good news was we found a lot of really positive things that we could share. Some of the most striking ones are around top managers modelling good behaviours and core values such as respecting people. Firms creating a no-blame culture where people are encouraged to speak up, and having effective processes in place so that they listen to people and respond to concerns. So we published the report on that review last year, and I'll show you the link for that later. Has lots of this material in it, so if you haven't read the report, please do, it's really helpful. And we also published some regulatory guidance alongside that report, which I'll come back to in a moment. I just wanted to touch on the rule changes that Juliet mentioned at the start. So after the thematic review, our board thought that it would be worth consulting on expanding our codes of conduct for solicitors and firms, just to be really explicit, as Juliet said, about the fact that this is a regulatory concern for us, we take it seriously, and that we will take action in serious cases of poor culture in firms. So we ran a consultation in 2022, had a very helpful response with some really good questions and challenge. And following that consultation, our board decided to make the rule changes that are on the slide. So I won't read those out, but they are hopefully fairly straightforward. One thing to flag about them is that you'll see in the Code of Conduct for solicitors, there's a requirement for managers to challenge behaviour that doesn't meet the standards we expect. And that's managers at the partner level in terms of our glossary of our rules. We originally consulted on that applying to all solicitors, but we had some very helpful and constructive challenge, including again from Law Care, that said that that might be actually counterproductive in terms of the pressures that it could put on more junior staff or people who are themselves being treated unfairly. So those rule changes were agreed in April this year, and we published updated guidance on them in May. So I mentioned earlier that we published regulatory guidance, and this is a formal regulatory tool that we use to help people that we regulate understand what we expect, and it is something that we can refer to if we're looking into concerns. So we have guidance on the workplace environment that was originally published in 2022, and we updated it to reflect the rule changes. I also wanted to flag we've got guidance on effective supervision that we published in November last year. And that's worth looking at in this context as well, because supervision isn't just an important way of achieving compliance generally, it's also a really important part of building that sort of healthy culture where people are listened to and concerns are addressed. So there's lots of material in there. Highly recommend reading it if you haven't already. I won't sort of go through the main points, but there are a couple of them on the slide, and you won't be surprised that they very much reflect some of what I've talked about that came out of the thematic review in terms of having the right processes in place and making sure that concerns are dealt with. So I'll end with that flag for the resources that are available. So that's where the regulatory guidance is and the workplace culture review is. So please do have a look at those. And we can probably just leave that up to leave.
I was going to say, yeah, we can leave that up so you can take that down, or I can see some people are doing it the modern way of just taking a photo of it. So, Jodie, can I turn to you next? So, because you, as I said, were involved in that thematic review, and you know, it was really great to have your input into that. And I know from our previous conversations that, you know, you see workplace culture as something, it's not just a compliance issue, but as Tony said, but also as something that can really add value for clients and staff. So I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about any top tips for, you know, building a good culture in a growing firm, but also any tips for overcoming any challenges that you saw.
Yeah, for sure. So I launched Thrive 5 years ago on my own. We're a small firm, and we don't have a kind of head of wellbeing or a head of HR. In fact, we don't have a HR person, that's me. So for me, it was all about role modelling behaviours and making sure that I was practising what I preached. Certainly sharing my own story of having mental health struggles has helped my team. And recently we were featured in the ACAS guidance as a case study, because one of my staffs now shared her story and said how actually in her interview for Thrive, she told me she had a panic attack on the way. And so creating that culture right from the outset for me was of paramount importance, partly for me to feel like I was safe in my own firm, but also for me to create a firm that had a positive culture that would attract people who shared those values. So that was the starting point for me in terms of like top tips. I'd say it has to come from the top, so role modelling those behaviours. And then you mentioned about as well, you know, when you've got people making mistakes, how you react to that, how you handle those problems. Again, role modelling that type of behaviour I think is really, really important. And another point, I'm not stealing all your points here, but ED&I, really, really important as well, because if it seems like the culture is tick box in response to well-being or ED&I, and what I mean by that is that lots of initiatives are happening, but actually people don't feel like they belong. So there's lots of diversity, potentially, but not as much inclusion. What we find is that actually people either leave or they just become really disengaged. So the ED&I point is really, really important when you're trying to create a workplace culture that's positive, especially when you're growing, because you want to take those people that you've already grown with you along that journey. And I'd also say autonomy as well, giving people autonomy. We work smart, so people work from anywhere. We don't have billable hours, and we trust people to get on with their jobs. Seems crazy in a lot of law firms. They go, how do you do that? But it does work, and we've grown significantly off the back of actually having good processes in place, clear values and clear indicative behaviours that link to those values, which we created with the team. And then from there, actually be able to give each other 360 feedback off the back of that. So it's not just me going, you have to do this, this is the rules, these are what we expect, these things we expect you to do. Instead, we get people involved, we give them a voice, and we encourage innovation. And that's a lot of tips. But essentially that's really where, you know, growing it from, you know, I was 4 years PQE and have grown it without any leadership experience, and that's, you know, getting that information from my team and asking what they want is just as important as understanding what I want and what the clients need.
Thank you very much. And so turning now to Bahari, if I can, you lead on risk and compliance issues, as I said, for a large firm that's created its own internal framework and internal code of conduct, which is really interesting. And I just wondered if you could let us have some insights into why the firm decided to take that step. And, particularly given the large firm context, how do you make sure that the firm's values and what you're doing sort of relate meaningfully to staff across the business?
Thank you, Juliet. Well, of course, we do already have our own professional code, which really clearly sets out what the regulator expects and what the general public expect. But for me, compliance is ultimately about culture. And as we all agree, if you're going to drive the right kind of culture, you really need to be very clear about your expectations and what that means for you as a firm. And I think that's what our code really is intended to do. And really, I think for me, it's important that we have set some boundaries, real clarity around what we mean by the values and by the principles, what is and isn't acceptable. And I know this sounds like a simple thing, but actually it's really honing in and getting real clarity around what for us as a firm is and isn't acceptable, where the boundaries sit. And that's actually been really, really important because it's underpinned by a number of examples, and these examples have to evolve. And I have to tell you, if you haven't done this exercise of sitting down and trying to work out between you within leadership and within your teams, the examples that fit within these boundaries, it's actually a really interesting process just to do in its own right, because you suddenly realize that even within your leadership team, you don't really necessarily agree on these things. It's not black and white. So that was actually for us quite a transformative process and experience to go through, where we really had to sit down and actually stand behind what we were saying, and really lots of consultation. And of course, all of that comes together, hopefully, to try and create an environment where people understand the expectations, and also, more importantly, they understand the consequences of not following through, not complying. So being very, very transparent about that. I suppose the one thing I would say about a code of conduct is that it can't be standalone. And for me, that was ultimately the real driver behind sort of introducing a code of conduct. It really needs to be the fundamental pillar of a compliance framework or a compliance management system. And that was originally the first driver for me. I went to our managing partner at the time, Matthew Layton, and our GC, Chris Perrin, saying, you're not going to like this, but I think we need a framework to really start to manage our compliance relevant risks. The environment that we were starting to see back then 5 or 6 years ago was a lot more sort of regulatory change, a lot more complexity, and it's not simply, I think, enough to be able to just kind of manage that on the hop. You really need a framework that allows you to have a proper process around how you identify, assess, and manage your compliance risks and roles and responsibilities. So for anyone who sort of studies compliance, you'll know that that is the fundamental hook that you hang everything else off. Your code of conduct says, this is what you can and can't do, and then all your policies hang from that. So that was really initially the driver for me.
Thanks very much. I mean, lots of very interesting things that both you and Jodie have said, and I'm sure we want to come back and pick up some of the themes and the sort of and the comments that you've made. But before that, I just want to go to Elizabeth. And Law Care obviously has immense experience in understanding and hearing about the challenges of working in the law. And we've just heard from two firms that have quite perhaps coming to things from different places and different perspectives. But I just wondered if you could give some insights on what you're seeing in law care across the piece. And I'm really interested to hear, how do you think the sector is responding? Have you seen any changes? What are you seeing from your perspective?
So I think generally we're seeing a lot more discussion around mental health and well-being and culture in the legal profession. We're here today at this conference talking about it, and it was on the agenda last year as well. The Law Society have a conference tomorrow on the future of work. Lots of these topics are being touched on there as well. This is an issue in legal education as well. So it's across the profession that we're all talking about it. I think a challenge is making sure we join that up and that we recognize that we all have a collective responsibility as practitioners, as educators, as regulators, as professional bodies to really be harnessing the greater enthusiasm and interest that there is and turning that into tangible actions. So I think there's a lot of discussion. The challenge is how we actually make that into something that's going to make a longer term difference. I think also it's important that this is not just unique to the jurisdictions in the UK. This is a global issue. So the International Bar Association have been doing a lot of work as well around mental health and culture. They're addressing that through research that they've done. It's also a hot topic for their conference that's coming up in a couple of weeks' time in Paris. Large jurisdictions like the United States, Australia, and New Zealand around the world, everybody's beginning to talk about these concerns. And I think that gives us an opportunity also to be sharing and learning from others about how they're addressing these challenges. So I think we're seeing more sharing about best practice. Jodie talking about what she's been doing in her firm, what you've been doing at Clifford Chance. So I think that's a really encouraging, positive step that's taking going forward. And I think there's that recognition now that culture is so important to a sustainable way of working in the law, and that we've got to carry on plugging away at that and actually not just talking about it and actually making it tangible. I think in terms of the bigger challenges we face and the wider issues is that I think we all need to recognize that we are in a period of massive disruption within the workplace. I heard the expression the other day that this is the decade of disruption, that post-pandemic world that we are all adjusting to. We're still coming out of the pandemic. COVID is still with us, and the implications of the longer-term impacts are still there for many people. And there's that evolving expectations of work. There's lots of discussion around Gen Zs, and now I think there's the latest generation is Alpha. That kind of gap of not always of not understanding their expectations. And I think we need to see that generation coming into the workplace is actually the carriers and the messengers about how things are changing and what's going to need to change in the way we do things if we want to continue to attract and retain people in our profession. But I think a really important point that I want to make is we need to recognize that there are actually inherent risks to mental health in the way we work in law. And traditionally we've tended, and it's a good thing, there's been lots of engagement and discussion around how we support people when they're struggling. Firms will provide access to EAP or counseling, education, support, and training. But we need to take that further and actually look at the way we work, the behaviors that we're addressing, that the SRA have brought in to address through the new rule change, but also the kind of endemic issues we have in law, like working long hours, toxic workplaces, poor management and supervision, bullying and harassment in the workplace. The WHO clearly recognized that these are factors that undermine people's mental health. Where I'm sure we will see a strengthening around legislation in the UK around employers' responsibilities to protect people's mental health in the workplace. I know that the EU are looking at bringing in regulations around this. Australia have already introduced stronger laws as your responsibility as an employer to be looking after the mental health of your people, and that's looking at how you work and what you're doing to mitigate the risks of those working practices that might undermine mental health. And I'll just tell you an anecdotal story. I was talking to someone last week who's recently retired from the health and safety executive. He was a very senior organizational psychologist. He was actually at the Labour Party conference, and he just had dinner with Wes Streeting. So that must tell us that it's on his agenda as the shadow health minister, potentially the health minister if what happens within our next election, that they're obviously interested in looking at mental health in the workplace, because I think for governments and nations around the world, the bigger term implications are when something like 50 or 60% of people are sick from work is with a mental health issue. That's having a massive impact on our social care, our health service. Governments are having to step in and support people. So I think the direction of travel is that there will be greater onus on employers to be tackling these issues. So I think it's important to be alive to the changes and where we're headed with this and see it as an opportunity to really seize the nettle now and not find ourselves still talking about these issues in the same way in 5 or 10 years' time, but actually taking those steps to start challenging some of those die-hard ways of doing things in law that we think, well, that's how we've always done it, we can't change it, because we're going to have to change it.
And that's really interesting to hear that and to hear your anecdote. And, you know, certainly something I've heard is that this is on the agenda of insurers as well, because they're really mindful of the fact that, you know, well-being of staff is really key to mitigating against, you know, risks, if it's around negligence claims or days off work or the like. So this is certainly something that, you know, they're taking very seriously and, you know, considering as part of their risk assessments of firms, and, you know, that will translate obviously into premiums and the like.
Thank you. So please do put your questions for our panel into the link underneath the broadcast. We've had a couple come in so far. So I'm going to pick up first a question. Elizabeth, you talked a little bit there about the practice of law and its inherent, you know, some of the inherent sort of issues around the practice of law and how that impacts upon well-being and the culture in the workplace. I've got a question. Perhaps I'm going to go to Bahari first with this. It's really about the long hours culture and, you know, the pressure that some sort of really very high billable hours targets can bring to bear. So it's really about, the question is how can a balance be struck between that culture and improving workplace well-being, especially when the, you know, profit of the firm and its workload is dependent on you know, driving sort of time targets.
Thank you, Julia. I think it's safe to say that this is very much an issue across the profession at whatever level. And certainly if you're working in an organisation where there are increasing pressures, you've got pressures from clients, you've got pressures that are often enhanced in an environment where you're seeing sort of the economic situation worsening. It's really, really important for firms to actually be able to identify any hotspots within their organisation. And as I say, it's particularly relevant at times where you see the external environment worsening. And so I think really, in order to be able to strike the right balance, first of all, you need to work out where it is within your organisations you might have the problem. And how you go about doing that, whether it's a question of, you know, regularly checking in on teams where there is high leverage, or whether it's checking in regularly in areas to find out if there's particularly high utilisation going on. And I think it's important to remember this is not actually an HR issue. This is something which drives ultimately culture and behaviour. And so I think increasingly for us, it's a priority to make sure that we're identifying any areas within the organisation where the working hours or the working culture might be moving to an area which is perhaps for us less acceptable, and finding ways to intervene. And I think once you have a bit of a mechanism, a reporting structure around that, then you can hopefully introduce measures to really start to address some of these challenges that I think we're going to continue to see across the profession.
Thank you very much. And I don't know whether Jodie or Elizabeth, you want to come in on that sort of that question of long hours and how you balance that. But I'm very interested to hear what you said, Bahari, about, you know, being able to sort of track hotspots, and I'm sure that's something that others who are listening will that will really chime with them.
I mean, I would just add that I think a long hours culture is endemic in the law. It's not just in big city law firms. It's across all parts of the profession and the different types of environments that people work in. And I know we haven't brought up the question of the billable hour, which is kind of related to this and is something that always crops up. But I think we're moving into an era, and it's really interesting when, you know, Jodie talks about her firm where they don't have billing targets. There are newer models now that are beginning to emerge, value pricing, looking at how we value the work that we do. And I think that one of the challenges we have around mental health and culture in law is that what we ultimately value are the hours that people put in, rather than actually looking at what the outputs are. So what have we actually delivered or achieved? And when it comes to promotion opportunities and determining how people are performing, a big indicator of that is looking at the hours they've put in and their chargeable hours. And I think that leads to some fundamental issues that we have where people feel not everyone's able to put those hours in. That's quite excluding, but also it's saying at the end of the day, for all the talk of all the other things that we do in our organization, when it comes down to it, we're measuring your performance and your value to us by what you deliver in terms of billables. And I know that firms are beginning to look more creatively at the other things that people bring in. And I think that is a fundamental challenge in the law, is how we measure success. We're not always looking at the wider indicators there are. Did we deliver a good service to our clients? Would they recommend us to somebody else? Have we delivered this with minimal impact to ourselves, our own people, and the people that we're serving? So I think there is a wider debate. It's a bit of the elephant in the room, and I think it's something that we do need to start addressing and thinking more creatively about how we actually measure what people contribute to their organizations. You know, you might have someone in a team that may not be the highest biller, but they might be the anchor person in that team, the person that everyone else turns to provide them with the answer to a question, or provides them with a sense of security, or makes them feel they belong. So without that person, you may not find the rest of the team are going to deliver in the same way, and we don't always pick that up. So I think there's a lot. I think you could probably have a whole conference on these issues, but I think there's a wider piece around that, and it's good to hear that firms like Clifford Chance are beginning to look for where those hotspots may be, where people may be working extremely long hours, because that does have an impact on people's mental health if it's not well managed.
Yes, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, and this is an issue that really came up in our thematic review in a couple of ways. I mean, firstly, that point that you made, Elizabeth, about, you know, one of the things that really affected people's well-being at work and people's sort of experience of the culture of their workplace was that link between reward, really valuing hours spent to the exclusion of any other you know, behaviors or value or teamwork or collaboration or sort of other things that they contribute to the workplace, as you say. And we also did hear that billable hours is perhaps the one thing that respondents to our survey on our thematic, you know, most wanted to see rid of in the impact it would have on the firm's culture. So I mean, it's certainly something that is a hot topic. And Jodie, obviously you've approached this in a very different way, and I don't know if you wanted to say a few words about how that works in your firm.
Yeah, for sure. It's similar to what Elizabeth was saying. We don't actually monitor people based on hours billed. We monitor on output. So there is a financial target, but it's different to a billable hours financial target. And they're also monitored on behaviours, where the whole firm actually on a monthly basis will score each other on a 360. And the scores are weighted, and we collectively created that. So it was, these are the values that are important, these are behaviours that we want to see. And so even if someone is a really good biller and is smashing their targets financially, unless they display the behaviours that support the positive workplace culture, they're not eligible for bonus. So we're linking all of that together and having this as a people first, behaviour first approach rather than a finance first approach. So in a nutshell, that's kind of how we've approached it, moving away from the billable hours traditional model and trying to see, well, what is it that's really important to us and how do we maintain that culture? So not me telling the team, you know, you have to behave in a certain way. It's that these things are really important for us. So that's, you know, not just the junior staff, it's what they expect from me as a leader as well. So I'm also up for scrutiny, which is always fun.
Juliet, the other thing I think I would add to what Jodie was saying is that the reality is that making sure you're managing stress-related risk in your organisation is extremely sensible, quite aside from being the right thing. We know that often stress is going to be the driver for a lot of the bad behaviour that we have seen, not just in our profession, but in other professions as well. We know that it can often be the underlying factor around mistakes, you know, when you're doing things late at night, when you're doing things under pressure, and so on. So I think, you know, if you ever need an excuse or if you ever need a reason to talk to your leadership team to say, look, we have to actually fundamentally address this, we need to identify it and manage it. Those are some sort of, I think, some hard examples of why it makes total sense.
Thanks, Bahari. So we've had a few questions come in, which are all around the sort of the area of compliance or reporting or enforcing concerns. First of all, Bahari, how do you enforce your code of conduct within your firm? And also a question about how do you make sure that you escalate concerns if the SRA needs to intervene? And then I'll pick up too, because there's a couple of questions about what we look at when things come across our door.
I think the key thing about introducing a code is to remember it has to be a journey. It's one thing to write the code down. I mentioned when we met in person, the challenges that you sort of have to work through in just agreeing some of the fundamental basics around what is acceptable in your firm and what isn't. But more importantly, once you've got it written down, the key is that you need to communicate it and you start to embed it. And that for us has been the biggest, I guess, part of the journey, and has been the longest part of it, where we have really spent the last sort of 18 months, 2 years focusing on making sure that the tone at the top is set, and that actually we're very proactive in communicating our code, in holding workshops, and in particular we have workshops where we bring together people from across the firm. There's an awful lot of diversity that we try and include in these workshops, and we encourage our people to start talking through these scenarios and some of the indicative behaviours. And I think that's when some of the really interesting conversations happen. You start to see the different perspectives. But also ensuring that you're creating an environment where people feel that they do have a voice, you do have a speak up culture. So all of that sort of starts to build confidence, and really making sure that you're following through when, and I have to say this is probably the hardest thing as you go across your journey, but when people are in breach of your code, you really have to be doing the right thing, and you have to be seen to be doing the right thing. And I think as firms, sometimes we're reluctant to share some of these war stories because you're afraid of the reputational damage, you're afraid of, upsetting people and so on. But the reality is people need to understand the consequences and understand that you as an organisation are serious. And as I say, it's a journey that you will need to go on. And it does really need to be underpinned and supported by, training across the entire organisation. And I suppose that's particularly relevant to your point about, how issues escalated. I can see that there will always be reluctance, particularly when you're a junior person. How do we make sure that particularly the younger people within the organisation feel that they have the voice and they're able to raise it? And you really need to make sure that where these things are raised, that the people who are receiving the issues and the concerns, they've got the right training and understanding of the escalation process so that they are effectively then managing it. Because the only thing worse than not sort of communicating it properly is to be in a situation where someone raises something, but actually as an organisation, you're not handling it properly. And that really has the potential to have a very detrimental impact. So making sure that across the organisation, there's a clear understanding around what the escalation processes are and how people are supposed to handle it.
Thank you. Yes, and I think that issue about making sure that you address concerns when they're raised. So there is, and Jodie mentioned this earlier, it's actually, visibly sort of demonstrating that you're taking concerns seriously, you're creating a space where people feel that they can speak up and it's worth them speaking up. They don't have that sort of sense of, well, there's no point saying anything because nothing's going to happen anyway. I mean, I think that's the sort of counter, isn't it? But that's something that's very important, and actually we cover that in our guidance, on the new rules, because it really is so important in creating the right in creating the right culture. So the question, a question came through about the reporting obligation, and particularly whether the SRA wants to know about employment tribunal matters, and there was a mention of sort of discrimination claims. I think to that end, I would just say that not everything not everything that, Bahari, you might be seeing and looking at in when you're looking at kind of compliance with your code of conduct, not every issue will need to be reported to us. I mean, our reporting obligation attaches to things where there's a reasonable belief that the issues are serious enough to that they could amount to a serious breach of our rules and regulations. The new code rule isn't intended to really change the threshold in terms of the kinds of risks and kinds of issues that we would be concerned about. So not all matters that might result in an employment tribunal. It's not sort of taking us into the area of enforcing employment law or being interested in everything that would go to an employment tribunal. It's really about those issues that create a regulatory risk, where the environment in the firm will means that service to clients would be impacted, or where there might be behaviours which are really inappropriate or improper. Along those lines, discriminatory conduct is certainly something that we are interested in, and certainly something that we would and have taken action about. We have separate code rules and principles to make sure that we can enforce it where we see discriminatory conduct in firms, and counter-inclusive behaviours as well. So those are the kinds of things that we would be interested in, but not every matter that might be an employment law matter or that might result in an employment tribunal. But I think one of the things that's been really interesting in the discussion we've had around our new rules, both in the consultation period and particularly in the response we've seen in firms to the new rules, is firms seeing the real importance of making sure that their HR teams and their compliance teams work closely together, so that the expertise of compliance officers in understanding and assessing issues and concerns against that reporting obligation can be brought to bear, and that where there are matters or concerns that are raised through to the HR team, there's that real link, there's that real kind of collaboration between HR teams and compliance teams to understand when it becomes a regulatory issue and should be reported to us. So I think that's something that's been quite an important conversation in firms, as I've seen, that's come out of the back of the work that we've done. And I know that one of the questions we came through to us is, is it advisable to have an individual in the firm responsible for compliance issues, or should this go through HR? And I think, from my point of view, I think it's really important to make sure that actually, and one of the really positive impacts I've seen from the work we've done is that conversations about behavioural issues are now, more and more increasingly on the plate of compliance teams, and are being raised to more senior levels in firms, and they're not only being dealt with as HR issues. But that's not to say that obviously there isn't an important role there for the HR function, but it's about the two working together. I wondered, we had a question in which I don't know, Jodie, if you might pick this up in the first instance. How can you create a culture where people feel able to report work culture concerns without fear of it blotting their copybook? So how can people kind of get over that barrier really in the first place to speaking up?
I think it comes back to what I was saying at the event about role modelling behaviours, and obviously how you deal with it as well. So if the way that the firm deals with something is replicated then by the rest of the management team, and then time and time again you see that these repeated behaviours are happening, then often what you find is that people just stop raising things because they possibly don't think it's psychologically safe to do that as well. So creating the culture of a kind of a top down. So like, for example, if I make a mistake, I hold my hand up and I role model that behaviour. Because I think it's really important to show as well that none of us are perfect. Doesn't matter what level we're at, we're all going to make mistakes. And it's about, whether it's a mistake or it's a workplace behaviour or a cultural thing or it's a compliance or a legal thing, whatever it is, none of us are perfect. And I think as lawyers, we are, most of us are perfectionists, so we try to be. So it's definitely a trait that a lot of people carry as lawyers. So creating that kind of top-down approach, and then role modelling those behaviours and training the managers on how to deal with these things effectively is really important. So like in my firm, I get even the most junior member of staff will call me and tell me if they think something doesn't feel right, even though if it's not, they're not telling someone off, they're not seen as doing something wrong by doing that, but they might say, well, I saw this and I didn't think it was quite right, but I'm not sure, so could I talk to you about it? So it's not having to go down a formal process. They know it's safe to have that conversation, and if we agree that it isn't right, then we deal with it. Or it might just be that they go, well, actually yeah, having spoken to you, I feel better about it. So it's having those points of contact as well, and making sure that managers have the space to deal with things, I think is really important.
I think that point about role modeling of leadership has just come out so clearly, hasn't it? And it's really kind of came out in our thematic review. And that point you say about making sure that actually people who are having to deal with hearing those concerns have the space, have the training, have the support to be able to do so, and have those difficult conversations, and actually be able to respond in a way that, you know, conveys the sort of seriousness with which they take the concerns and are able to behave in an appropriate way. I've got a very interesting question that's come through, which I'm sure that all of you will want to answer from your own different perspectives, but it's about Gen Z and a sort of generational difference. The question is, do you think Gen Z have realistic expectations about work culture, or that firms explain it well enough on recruitment? So I don't know who wants to go first on that. Bahari, maybe you can go first on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's one that I think most firms have been grappling with for some time. I think it became particularly acute as we came out of COVID, to be honest. And in many ways, for a period of time, this was one of the top sort of people-related risks, certainly for us, sort of getting our heads around how we address the generation gap. And so what I would say is that in terms of realistic expectations, I'm not sure that it's realistic in the old traditional model. But what I would say is that we need to understand and accept that it is their expectation. It is just the way that it looks through their lens. And I think it's really futile to try and fight against it. I think firms really need to understand that there is a generational shift, there is a gap, that the old model isn't necessarily going to work in the same way, and that there's a completely different value proposition for the younger generation. They're just not happy to work as hard or as long in the same ways that we did. They find that for them, work-life balance is completely different to how it may have been for firms in the years gone by. So I think the key here is that whether we like it or not, there is a gap here, and it's about how you find a way to address that. And certainly I can see that there is going to have to be a bit of a change in our sort of traditional way and expectations. And I think it's really important to be having conversations with the senior partners within your firm, within leadership, so that we can start to bring this gap a little closer together, to make sure that we're starting to speak the same language. Because if we don't do that, there is increasingly the potential that you're going to have fallout. You're going to see problems and issues arise from that misunderstanding, from that sort of lack of a common understanding of what work-life balance means. So I mean, I'd be interested to know if anyone's got the answer, and we're certainly working on it. But the reality is, it's here to stay.
Thank you. I'm not sure. Do you, Elizabeth? Do you have the answer, or do you have thoughts or comments?
I don't have the answer at all, and I would say, as a parent of a Gen Zer aged 18, and I consider myself pretty well clued up. I am constantly challenged by some of the things my son says to me, and I really see how he thinks differently and approaches things differently to perhaps the way I would have done when I was his age. But I think this is a perennial challenge. All generations challenge the generations that have come before them. This is, you think back to the 1950s and the 1960s, the horror there was about Elvis Presley and the Beatles, and the concept of a teenager arose then. So I think this isn't a new phenomena. This is what happens in society and in our culture. But I think the important thing is, and I realized when I actually said it in the pre-recorded piece, is I think it's important to recognize that the people coming into the workplace now are the messengers and carriers of how things are changing and the different expectations. And that if not only law firms, but all professions and workplaces want to attract and retain young people coming into work, then you've got to get with the program and understand where they're coming from. And I think, there might be some merit in things like reverse mentoring programs within law firms and organizations, where you actually bring people together and have that opportunity to understand where you're each coming from. Because I think a lot of this is a communication gap, really. The people my age generation thinking, oh, well, this is just a bunch of snowflakes who don't want to work. They're lazy. They're not motivated. They're kind of put into that bracket. They're not prepared to do things the way we did. We had to put all these hours in. We're not prepared to kind of accept people that don't want to do that. Whereas they've come through a different experience, particularly young people coming into the workplace now who have had their education interrupted or their early working lives by COVID, haven't had perhaps some of those opportunities to be in a workplace surrounded by other people at the early stages of their career. They're newer to some of this, and I think we shouldn't overlook that. You know, my husband is a trustee in a different setting of a multi-academy trust where they include primary schools, and they're seeing issues with 5-year-olds coming into reception who didn't have that nursery education and opportunity to mix with other children and toddlers, have got more behavioral issues at school aged 5. So it's not rocket science to think we might be seeing, I'm not saying there's behavioral issues with Gen Zers, but they've been through an experience perhaps that they weren't as well equipped to handle as perhaps an older generation who've been through more. So I think it's about learning and understanding and providing an opportunity to listen, because ultimately we need Gen Zs in the legal workplace. So we've got to find a way to bring them in and create an environment where they're going to want to stay and be in our profession, because we need that. And I think if you've got children, I'm sure many people do, of a Gen Z era, just sit down and talk to them. I'm sure you're challenged as much as I am. But you know, this is not a new problem, I think, is what I'm trying to say. This is something that crops up regularly with all new generations coming into the workplace with different ideas and thinking about things, and we should be listening, because this is how evolution happens.
Yeah, that's a very good point, well made. And I totally can understand the power of techniques like reverse mentoring to make sure you have a sort of structure for those conversations to happen. That's certainly something that we've been doing at the SRA and has been hugely valuable. I just wondered, I mean, that does sort of flip the focus onto actually the sort of views of senior leaders. I just wondered if anybody had any tips about the challenges of getting sort of senior leaders to think about their behavior or change their behavior. There's often partners in firms have been very used to doing things autonomously for a long time, and it can be difficult to particularly for compliance teams, I know, to try and sort of affect change. Any thoughts about how to drive changes in behaviours with those from those at the top?
Certainly, I mean, I have found one of the most effective ways to do this, and I think this is also reflected in the changes that you've recently introduced, is really to encourage sort of more intervention at a peer level, to create an environment where you've set the expectations, you've set the tone, you have your code, everybody has a clear understanding of what is and isn't acceptable. And then to make sure that where things are starting to perhaps go in the wrong direction, that you have another senior person sort of intervening. And I think that one of the things that we talk about in some of the workshops we run is that not every intervention has to be an immediately jumping up and down, disgracing, shouting, reporting to the regulator. You should be looking at these things where you're seeing issues, sort of a more subtle intervention to begin with where appropriate. If you're seeing that someone has a particular style that's clearly not going down well, I think it's really incumbent on your fellow partners and the rest of the leadership team to really start to have that conversation. So being very open and honest with each other within the leadership team, within the partnership, and actually having these honest conversations, which I think historically in most firms haven't really taken place, but also to do that at a point before it becomes problematic. is I think, you know, dealing with the root cause of issues before they really escalate is really, really important. Not just leaving it, not just saying, well, you know, that's fine, that kind of thing, you know, that's just their style or whatever. So really starting to encourage that sort of interaction and making sure that the leadership team within an organisation, the partnership, all feel responsible for collectively driving the right kind of culture. I think it's quite a good technique to employ.
Thanks very much indeed. Well, we're nearly at time. I have one last question, which is for Jodie, because I know there'll be many who are on the call who might be saying, well, you know, it's great if you're in a large firm and you've got sort of money and resources and people to put behind, you know, driving change and thinking of new ways of doing things. But, you know, that's really difficult if you're a small firm and you're, as you said before, kind of wearing many hats. Any final sort of tips on, you know, how you can go about things without calling on huge resources?
For sure. Well, for me, it was really about making it part of the wider business strategy. So not having it as a separate department or a separate thing that needs to be done. It's actually embedding all of this into the workplace culture and the way that we work. So by doing that, everybody's responsible for their own behaviours and for helping each other to improve. But equally, it doesn't require someone to be, you know, the head of wellbeing or the head of HR or compliance or whatever it might be, to get started. Yes, you might want to get to that point, but the key thing is to just get started. There are lots of little things that you can do, such as role modelling behaviours, such as looking at your processes, looking at the way that you monitor performance management and all of that stuff. All of that you can do yourself. You don't need someone to come in and do that for you. So it's really looking at all areas of the business and seeing like what little tweaks can you make and gradually doing it. You don't have to do a massive grand gesture, one big change, and you know, everything happens at once. It's about those small consistent tweaks that actually get you towards where you want to be. And for me, I think it's the consistency piece has been key in maintaining that as well.
Thank you very much indeed. So I just want to, you know, finish by saying thank you so much to all of our speakers. Thank you for taking time to share your thoughts, you know, both at the session and the pre-recorded, the insights that you shared there and today in this live Q&A. Thank you ever so much to everybody who joined the call. I'm very sorry if we didn't get to your question. We're going to look to see if there's anything that we can pick up in themes in any future webinars. And if you do have any specific queries, then of course, please do give our ethics helpline a call, because they can offer support if you've got any specific concerns or queries that you want to talk through. All the resources from today's webinar can be found on our on-demand pages. I think we've had a really interesting and valuable discussion. But we want to know what you think. Did this format work for you? How could we improve it? Please do click on the feedback link, which is you know, below the video, and let us know your views. There are going to be further sessions shown this week in our virtual compliance conference. The next one will be conversation with the SRA Chair and Chief Executive, and that's going to be shown tomorrow morning at 10:30. But for now, that's it for today. Thank you very much for coming, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.